Hello and welcome to another episode of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. The show is nearly 5 years old now. However, for listeners who might be new to all this, the idea is that I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Before we start, I'm delighted that the headline sponsor for this series of the podcast and the Material Matters Fair taking place from the 20th to the 23rd of September at Bargehouse, Oxo Tower Wharf is Burt Frank. The premium British lighting brand, based in London and Birmingham, will mark its 10th anniversary this month at the London Design Festival, with new product launches that celebrate the considered use of exceptional materials, in addition to reimagining some of its most popular designs into new forms. Together, these launches outline an exciting new chapter for the brand that has championed the globally recognised hallmarks of British design, quality, craftsmanship and innovation since its inception. So, my guests this week are Tom Lloyd and Luke Pearson, who together co-founded the hugely influential design studio Pearson Lloyd in 1997. Since then, it's gone on to work in areas such as the workplace, transport and healthcare, with brands like Virgin, Lufthansa, the Department for Health and furniture giant Senator. The practice is the Designer of the Year at Material Matters, and we'll be using the space to investigate how its use of materials has been transformed over recent years, including projects from the likes of Modus, Batch.Works, Howe, Flokk, Profim and Camira. Tom, Luke, very nice to see you. How the devil are you both?
Very well, thank you.
Very good, Grant.
Good. We're talking on Zoom, so it'd be good to know where you are because you're not in the same room for technical reasons. So, Tom, you appear to be, I don't know, in a cell-like place. What's happening there? Because Luke, he's got all the books and you've got, I don't know, what's behind you? Some drawings.
So I'm downstairs in the gallery space of Yorkton Workshops where we are based in Hackney.
Right.
And actually, funnily enough, I've cobbled together a kind of acoustic booth out of some of the materials that are going into the exhibition at Bargehouse.
Very good.
Next
Very
week.
Good plug as well.
So this is exactly. So this is live. This is live use of acoustic coconut matting and latex and cotton and wool for the purposes of the podcast.
Very good. And Luke, you're in the library somewhere.
Well, not really. I'm sort of upstairs in this room that sometimes we still call the meeting room. When we bought the building, which was sort of pre-COVID, we were still, I guess, designing it with the sort of vain hope that we'd have meetings and people coming in. And over the last 3 years, it's turned into a sort of slightly different space, which is much more about workshopping. So we quite often just call it Bay 1 upstairs now.
Okay. So the basement and Bay 1 upstairs. I mean, can we talk about your relatively new studio in London's East End? It's designed by Cassian Castle Architects. You took a warehouse and a Victorian workshop and kind of glued them together, really. I mean, in other words, it was a retrofit project. This was important to you, Tom, I'm guessing.
Yes, I mean, we were very lucky that we had a space for about 15 years in Shoreditch, and we'd been looking for a long time to build something ourselves. We did have a workshop up in central Hackney that was a bit too remote for us to really use effectively because you'd have to decide to go up there to work, whereas really workshops need to be very close to your daily life. So we were looking for a larger space, and to be honest, it's incredibly difficult to do that in London successfully. And this building finally came up in 2017 actually, and we had to buy it very, very quickly. At the time it was a fine art frame makers in the kind of museum sort of world. And it was a really cluttered, chaotic mash-up of different bits of architecture. We spent a long time actually planning to demolish it and build a new building. And then we kind of had a change of heart after about a year and rewrote the brief and turned it into a much more cherishing what was there brief, really, and thinking about it in sustainably and in circularity terms and in terms of looking after the fabric of the buildings that were already there.
So was there a moment where your heart changed in that case?
Yeah, and luckily Luke and I think we actually, the same month we came to the same conclusion almost independently, that we were forcing a project that was becoming more and more expensive and actually wasn't particularly giving the types of spaces that we wanted to use. And also we started to regret the idea that we were going to demolish some fairly good bits of fabric in the city in order to build something that we thought might be better. And when we flipped that around and started to really look after and look what we could keep, it became a much richer project for us.
Luke, can you describe it for us? Because it isn't just studios, is it? There's an event space there and there's lots going on.
Yes, well, I think just following on from Tom, the original building was very ambitious. We wanted to have an extra floor on the top. Getting a bit of freehold space in London is very rare. And I think for me, and I think also for Tom, slightly different motives for what we wanted to achieve in the building. But I'd always felt very sort of, in the first 2 years of living in London, I moved 14 times.
Whoa.
And the idea of...
were you squatting?
I was for a bit. But the idea of... the first 3 years. The idea of having your own space and having some control and then deciding what you could do with it was very compelling. When we originally set off and saw this site, it had quite a large footprint, and we thought, well, it would be lovely if we could have some spaces that we could rent to startups and young designers, maybe one-man bands who couldn't afford their own space typically. When we then changed tack and decided to repair and rebuild the building, there was a sort of slight reduction in the amount of floor space, but we wanted to retain the flexibility of the space to offer it up for different people, apart from just our studio, partly to sort of increase the cultural awareness of the local community, but also to make our lives a little bit more interesting in terms of the interface with art, design, and other cultures such as music. So downstairs we have, basically the building is 5 bays, which reflect the architectural layout of the houses that are on the corresponding street. So they're effectively the garden spaces or the coach spaces for these old houses. So there are 5 bays, and then we have another floor on top. So in bay 1 and 2 downstairs, we've decided, rather than renting those spaces, to keep it as a kind of open gallery space that we use it quite a lot of the time for mock-ups, but we also offer it up for charitable events or sometimes startups. Quite often there'll be auctions and things in there for charity. And it's really put us in touch with a whole load of people that we would naturally want to be in touch with, but perhaps through our professional careers we aren't in touch with. And then at the other end of the building, on the ground floor, we've got quite a big workshop space. We're still very, as Tom touched on, we let our workshop end up in another rented space in Hackney, and it was just too dislocated. We couldn't run downstairs and cut a piece of cardboard and see whether it changed the way we felt about a thing or a space or an environment. And so we really wanted everything to be very much at hand. And then upstairs we sort of have traditional design studios. So the plan was to build something that would give us some flexibility and contact to the local sort of community, but also provide a very flexible home for ourselves.
And were you an easy client, I wonder? Tom, I know you've worked with the architect before.
Yeah, and actually when we sort of pivoted away from a new build, we felt like we needed to find a new partner to build it, because we come to every meeting with as many drawings as the architect.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of architects wouldn't really appreciate that.
No, I imagine.
So, and Cass, I've done 3 or 4 projects with Cass before, and what's unique about Cass is that he's also the builder. So he has his own building firm, and it's only for building his own projects. He doesn't build other people's projects. And for this, it was especially as a refit project or a retrofit project, we were unearthing, making discoveries as we went through the process, and we could actually change, the design could respond in a more agile way because the architect was also the builder. So rather than having 3 parties to negotiate with, there was just 2. And we would have a daily kind of process of popping into site, which was luckily very close both to my house and also on the way to Shoreditch where our offices were. And so we collectively generated as we were going through the build. And it was also during COVID, actually. The second half of the build was early 2020. So the site only actually closed for 6 weeks, but we were constantly kind of feeding and sort of curating and creating the design as we went along. And Cass has actually built projects for other designers and architects before, so I think he understood the kind of collaborative nature of what we might have needed.
And has it affected your practice, either the way that you work? I mean, obviously it's more convenient because you have the workshop next to you now, but has it affected maybe what you design and how you think?
I think for me, the biggest thing is it's allowed us to become a kind of host.
Right.
We can welcome in people, but also culture or students, or when we get a lot of visitors. We have open house this week, and we're running tours through the building during this week and next week. And it's just often design studios are quite insular and quite introverted, and there's a sort of feeling that you're protecting people. You don't want to show stuff to people. And I think the way we've planned it, we can hide away our kind of confidential stuff if we need to, but we can really just welcome many more voices, many more people into the building than we might have done in the past. And definitely having the workshop. Luke and I keep on discussing what new machinery we might introduce into the workshop to kind of, really allow making to become a greater and greater part of our practice.
Interesting. Should we talk about the Material Matters Fair? Because you are our Designers of the Year and you have a room which is going to be entitled Material Change. So top line really at this stage, what can visitors expect? It's based around an essay that's on your website of the same name.
Well, for a long time, we've been, I think when we started out, we're both trained as industrial designers and furniture designers. So we've got this strange dichotomy between a love of craft and the creation of something through, material carving, in a way, carving something, crafting something into place, but also the industrial designer's approach, which is often reliant on technology and innovation and opportunities which maybe weren't there months before. And they're often at odds in many ways. And I think what we've been reflecting on is that over the years, we've been trying to produce well-crafted objects that are very well made, that stand up well for a good period of time and are relevant. And it's sort of, for a long time, we've been pushing that as a narrative, but underneath that, just realizing that it's not really enough. We've all been sort of moving through the words of sustainability. In fact, sustainability is an interesting thing because you can have a sustainably not very good situation in the sense that, you can have a hole in the bucket and you can carry on filling the bucket at the rate the bucket's emptying, but it's not a very good bucket.
Yeah, there's a nursery rhyme about that, isn't there?
Yeah, and circular's different because circular conjures up ideas of being regenerative and actually not causing damage, that what you take out can actually be put back in without an impact. And I think we were chatting about it today, this morning, and I think we're at a very interesting moment where enough people have access to the changes that are going to need to be made that we can accelerate the conversations that we've been trying to have for a long time. And we can take the conversations with people who are a little bit more, progressed down that road 2 or 3 steps further again. And I think what we wanted to do with the exhibition was not really so much say, look what we're doing, but just try and have an open conversation about what's happening in the industry and what needs to happen, and a little bit of exposure about, different facets of it. For example, like what we believe is good information today. We know that in 3 or 4 years' time, somebody will come up with a fact that means we've got to adjust it. So this isn't a sort of concrete mark. This is something that's fluid, that we all have to adapt, evolve, and treat as a continual learning curve. And so I think what we were trying to do was say, look, there are a bunch of projects here that we've done over the last 15 years, and look how our perspective has changed with regard to how we would design them, and the potential differences on the outcome, which can all be improvements.
So it isn't so much a paradigm shift, more of a kind of evolution is what you're talking about. Because, Tom, you've written about the way we need to think and how things need to change. I think as part of your other hat as head of the RDI, you wrote a kind of from novelty to longevity, from linear to circular, from extractive to regenerative, from exclusive to inclusive, from owned to shared, from design to co-designed, from human-centered to nature-centered. So this is where your practice is going, presumably.
It is, and I think it's what was interesting about the material change essay we wrote, which has become the exhibition, is that having just done a stepping back and having reviewed a dozen or so projects that span a sort of decade or more, we realised that we've been making choices that were very different to the decade before. And we were making choices about on the basis of carbon, on the basis of circularity, on the basis of repair, on the basis of all sorts of new value metrics that may not have been so apparent in the decades before. And for example, within circularity, you have to be much more keenly intentional about your supply chain of materials, because the choices you make from on a material choice has a massive impact on the carbon impact of that product. And Luke and I and Pearson Lloyd, we have always worked within a mass production paradigm, and we produce a lot of furniture and have done over the years. So we've realised that the impact we're making is also both good and bad. Is way beyond a batch of 100 items. So we're really keenly interested in challenging ourselves about the choices we're making in the design process. And I think that Royal Designer quote that you just played out was, we've been discussing that effectively the value proposition of what design should and can do is shifting. And the hierarchy of value is also shifting. And actually, the Design Council published a paper last year challenging us, or us being the design industry, around the idea of user-centered design. And I think our generation thought that user-centered design was brilliant. It's like, great, you can take care of the user. But if you take care of the user at the expense of the planet, you end up in trouble. So that's why the user-centered is nature-centered. It always has to be a balance, because you can't have one without the other, obviously. And we still have to have commerce, because we're all existing still in a commercial environment of consumption. And so the balance between environmental, social, and economic sort of needs is the thing we're challenging. And it's not just we. I think we're all having to challenge those things in order to make sense of the future.
I'm interested, and maybe this is one for you, Luke. I'm interested in scalability, because it's a big topic in the material world. There are new materials out there, some of which I'm sure you've worked with, and there are new ways of looking at old materials. I mean, we've done things like hemp on this show. But the question is how they reach a wider market rather than being one-offs or craft-based projects, which is kind of what you're talking about, and the fact that you're global and you're industrial in scale. So is this what is also buzzing around your head at the moment? How you make these materials, how they reach the mainstream?
Absolutely. And it's more complex than, in a way, saying everything should be grown. Because there are all sorts of implications on how you grow it, whether you're using, prime farming soil, or what are the byproducts of having to grow something. So, we're not saying that we will stop using plastic, for example, but, we have a project in the exhibition that was designed, conceived in 2010, and it was conceived before there was a viable waste stream that you could recycle from for polypropylene. So Howe said to us, look, we'd like to make it with zero glass fiber in it, because then we can recycle it later, because if it's got glass fiber in, you can't recycle it. But the ambition is that we can then use recycled material to make it in the first place. Now, there are lots of companies that are now producing recycled chairs, but what's quite interesting is a lot of those chairs still have glass fiber in, which means at the end of their life, they'll be junked. What was interesting about this project is that when we wrote the brief with Howe, we were quite clear that if it doesn't have any glass fiber in it, it can be circular. It can go round and round and round, and it can either be made into the same chair again, or it can be made into other products. And actually, plastic is an incredibly efficient material in terms of energy consumption. There's very, very little waste when you make it. So you've got to look at, and Tom was touching on this earlier, we've got to look at the sort of global impact of our decisions. And sometimes we'll be using materials which are finite, and they are valuable, and they need to be used very, very sparingly, and they need to be looked after and kept in the system, as opposed to coming to the end of their life and you can't recycle them. And other times it'll be about using materials that are completely regenerative, that, we can compost in the corner of the garden and we don't need to take to a recycling depot, or we could put them on our fire. And I think what we're trying to do is expand our sort of repertoire and our knowledge so that we can base these decisions on data, the best data at any one particular moment. And, just as an interesting point, we did a big project years ago, a mass-produced task chair, and we felt like we could save a bit more material, and the client wasn't particularly interested in that time on these minor savings because they'd hit target. And I decided to do a calculation, and there were literally hundreds, tens, thousands of cubic meters of plastic saved over the life of this product. So on a monetary perspective, there was no impact to them. But when you imagine that volume of plastic that could be saved, it's very, it creates a big impression. So I think one of the big things that we're trying to do with this exhibition is expose data, give people some sense of perspective so they can have or create their own sense of context around their decision-making process.
And also it seems to me, in this instance particularly, it's tackling prejudice, isn't it? Because plastic is demonised right now. I know that Polish company Profim and the seating collection that you made for them from recycled expanded polypropylene will be in the show, for instance.
One thing is, I think nature-based isn't natural materials. It's just putting nature as a sort of stakeholder in the conversation. And by understanding the impact of your decisions on nature, you then might change your decisions. But it's true, the Profim example is a very good one because we've actually replaced plywood, which is ostensibly a natural or a nature-based material, with a fossil fuel because it's more environmental.
Which appears counterintuitive to most people, right?
Very, very counterintuitive, yeah. For example, so plywood is 25% of the weight of plywood is glue. So it's effectively a composite material, which means it's very... And the problem with composites is the circularity, in principle, you need to pull apart your materials, disaggregate them into their component parts so that those materials can go back into the supply chain of industry and of manufacturing. And plywood is a great material in many ways, but it doesn't actually have very good circularity. It's very difficult to make into another thing again. And so we took with Profim, who were great partners because they spent so much time really analysing the data with us. We're using recycled polypropylene, so it's already in its second life. And there's a lot of data in that project which is highly impressive. For example, it's 40% lighter as a product. That affects transport, it affects how the materials are handled around the factory, how they can be manipulated or moved or changed by the user. But at the end of the day, it was a more circular. It was both slightly lower in carbon, actually. The plastic is about 6% lower in carbon than the plywood, but it's a much, much more circular product. And there's something that we're tuning into is there's a big difference between circularity and carbon. So you can have a low carbon product, but it's also very uncircular. And you can have a high carbon product, which is very circular. Obviously, the best is to have a low carbon product and is also very circular. And if you get those two, you've got a sweet spot that is, in principle, we want to maintain the viability of every bit of carbon for as long as possible into the future. And as designers, we've got to build out obsolescence of materials and make them useful for as long as possible.
I hope you're enjoying the episode. This is just to remind you that the Material Matters Fair is essentially here. The event, which is headline sponsored by the British lighting company Burt Frank, runs from the 20th to the 23rd of September at London's Bargehouse, Oxo Tower Wharf. It will be full of brilliant ideas and wonderful exhibitors. Picking out names is invidious. However, here goes. Look out for an environmentally active installation from Crafting Plastics Studio in collaboration with Duomo Lab Research. Julian Needham will be showing a collection of mirrors made from aluminium and paper, and there'll be glass from Joe Anderson's studio. There'll also be a slew of international exhibitors working in a variety of materials, such as hydro and regular concrete. Meanwhile, the likes of Biomatters, Silk Lab, Mycelium Lab and Material Magic will be illustrating how design can work with nature. If craft is your thing, then look out for work by the likes of Anna Bridgewater, also known as Abalon, Mixed Metals, Gareth Neal, leather expert Bill Amberg and The Wicker Story. And there are features from the likes of our Designer of the Year, Pearson Lloyd, who you've just been listening to. Danish designer Tanja Keers will have her extraordinary textiles made from hemp and citrus peel in our entrance hall. The Wood Awards will be unveiling its shortlist, while Insight Publishing has put together The Workspace, a space that showcases the latest and most innovative thinking on sustainable office design, circularity and innovation. And finally, Isola, the Milan-based design platform, will host a new exhibition on the third floor of Bargehouse. Nothing Happens If Nothing Happens will feature emerging designers using regenerative resources and repurposing waste materials. And did I mention there's a talks programme featuring Michael Young, the always lively Negroni Talks, and a bunch of other brilliant stuff? I thought not. It's all terribly exciting. Oh, and it's free for trade. You just need to register by going onto our website, materialmatters.design. There's also an Eventbrite link in the blurb that comes with this episode. See you there. I want to head back to glue for a moment. You talk about glue and plywood because, I mean, one of your more eye-catching statements recently has been that iconic chairs like Arne Jacobsen's Egg and Saarinen's Womb wouldn't be made today. Can you explain why?
It's a provocation because, of course, we all love those chairs and they are icons. And they, as people have told us from that piece of writing, you know, most of those chairs will last forever because they're cherished.
I mean, that's a counter-argument to it, isn't it? That they will last forever.
It is. But unfortunately, you can't rely on classics to solve the planet's problems, you know. And what the principle is, the womb chair, if you have a concave surface of, the womb chair is a piece of textile glued onto a molded piece of foam, which is molded onto a metal substructure. And so you've got three, if you include the glue, you've got 4 different materials that are permanently attached to each other. And those principles do not really support circularity. So what we're saying is, if you were putting the lens of circularity onto those products, you might not have made those decisions if you did it again. And one of the things we're beginning to chat about in the studio is the idea of the aesthetics of circularity, i.e. what is the language of design from both a material and a form perspective, where as soon as you start to support the needs of circularity, your decisions will change. And that's why we've provoked, and it was a very heavily commented.
Well, it was, and I was going to ask you about that, because one person below the line on DZine described it as, and I'm going to quote, clickbait PR strategy that, and I'll quote again, smells a tad too much of desperation. Does that bother you when people say things like that about you?
Not at all, because I think people love, the commenters love to comment, and that's okay, you know. So if we only speak to what we think everyone will approve of, then we would never speak.
I mean, it does seem to me that you're putting your ideas where your mouth is. You've created new furniture for classrooms recently for the British brand Senator, designed specifically for Gen Z, seemingly. It's a really intriguing project. I know it's not going to be part of the fair, but I still think we ought to talk about it. It seems you're bringing a lot of contemporary workplace theory to schools. I mean, you've talked about creating a cafe classroom, and it's about collaboration, education going forward. Why did you decide to tackle that issue? Because I think I'm right in saying you went to the manufacturer with the idea rather than the other way round.
Yes. The story came from, I was taking my older daughter around universities a couple of years ago to sort of, you know, as you do when you're choosing a place to go to study. And I just noticed that immediately it struck me that a lot of furniture was being misspecified in university spaces. They were it seemed to me there were 2 types of furniture, either classic classrooms, which is like stacking chairs and movable tables in a row up to a blackboard, or very, very quite sophisticated lounge chair in those kind of atrium spaces, which we know would be damaged very quickly and then would be very difficult to repair and then would have a very short life. So it was just some basic observations. And then we thought, actually, if we just took some of our research and our learnings from workplace, and we really went into the sort of higher education sector onto university campuses, and we asked questions, what sort of briefs for furniture might emerge? And that was the basis of the pitch to Senator, or the suggestion. And actually we have put Collab in as one of the case studies into the exhibition.
Oh, so people will be able to see it. Jolly good.
They will. And it's just primarily because it's not so much a carbon story as a circularity story, because we made it highly repairable and highly adjustable and highly reconfigurable.
Yes.
In order to hopefully prolong the life of those products for as long as possible.
In other words, there are things like visible fixings, like you can get to the screws and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's Luke, you should carry on in a minute, but that's another part of that essay I think that we wrote was, you know, in the old days when we started out, invisible fixings was a sign of status. You know, you can't see how it's been put together. It was like we would shout from the rooftops that. And now actually one of the principles of circularity is that you can disassemble and repair very easily without an instruction manual and without specialists. And so the ability to, the facilitating that type of process is just a very basic, simple principle of circularity that we've used quite strongly in that product.
I mean, Luke, I'm keen to bring you into this as well, because presumably price is a hugely important element of a project like this. I mean, as we're discovering with the rack scandal that's currently engulfing the UK, school budgets are extremely tight, bordering on non-existent. So are you convinced there's a market for this product?
Yes, I think, obviously it'll find its place in terms of who sees it to be functionally appropriate and relevant, and therefore has appropriate value. I don't think there are, it's difficult to judge things like for like in terms of cost, because obviously if you're looking at yesterday I was sitting in a school chair and it was absolutely appalling, and clearly it had been engineered to be as cheap as possible, and it just didn't have good ergonomics, and it's not going to last very long. So there is, these are other things in terms of the sort of circular debate. It's durability and repairability, and that brings me back actually to the provocation about, not designing things as we would have done maybe 15, 20 years ago. We're all guilty of making decisions that now we wouldn't make the same decision because we've got new information. And I think we're all coming to the conclusion as well that the reason why things don't get repaired is not just because you can't repair them, it's because they're too cheap. So, the value of a classic that carries on being worth the same amount of value is obviously different to something that isn't a classic. So in a way, if it's not a classic, it's even more relevant that you've got to be able to repair it, because it might have the same functional relevance, but you're not going to sort of nurse it along in terms of its existence just because it's a classic and it's got value. So it's the monetary value of buying a new one means, yes, I'll just go out and buy a new one. And so we've got to reverse out of that and try and design things that can be repaired. And they can be easily repaired. So, for example, can I get a cover in the post and can I put the cover on myself? Because there aren't upholsterers in our local towns anymore. So we have a lot of very complex issues that as designers we've got to look at in terms of how to build sustainable, circular product, smart product for the future. Because some of the systems, just like with Howe, the systems aren't in place. But, we're talking to companies at the moment about how do they support the repair program? Do they need, partners in certain specific destinations so that they can reduce the amount of travel? Do they bring products back to the factory, or do they go to somewhere else to have a sort of partial repair? And there are lots of very complex components to getting this to work. But I think from a designer's perspective, if we design it that it's all glued, we simply know it can't be repaired. Yeah.
So I'm intrigued. Are there things that you look back at your portfolio, which started in 1997, and do you now regret designing?
I think regret's a dangerous word, because I think if you knew what you were doing at the time and you did it willfully, then maybe you should be regretting it. But if it was to do with a lack of understanding, which might have been universal, then you can't beat yourself up about that. What you've got to do is look at what you did and what you know now and say, do I want to repeat the same decision-making process again? I don't think you can call it a mistake because people weren't having this conversation. The fact is, when molded polyurethane arrived, everybody was just so excited about the technical possibilities. I think there was a sort of runaway process of people designing things and sort of the potential for aesthetic innovation was getting in the way of maybe some very old school thinking about how you built things, what efficiency meant and things like that. So I think we've a little bit gone full circle.
No regrets?
No, I don't think regret. I mean, there are definitely projects. Well, we talk about projects and say we wouldn't do that project again.
Fair enough. I mean, you've done a lot of work in aviation, for example, Virgin, Lufthansa. I mean, is that still an area you're keen to explore?
Well, we're currently still working with Lufthansa, and I think we get on planes and we work internationally, so I think in some ways it would be a little bit hypocritical to say that, we're going to absolutely avoid aviation, but we're working with a company that has very, very ambitious targets for reducing their carbon. They're not a budget airline which is just interested in getting thousands of people into the air. And yes, it's a very, very complicated issue, but apparently aviation produces 4% of the carbon in the world each year. Food waste, in other words, the food that we choose to throw away, is 8%.
Oh yeah, there's no question that there are areas of life that use up far more carbon than aviation, no question.
So I think it comes back to your comment about demonizing things. Every single place where we're producing toxic impact to the environment or, huge amounts of carbon dioxide, of course we've got to try and reduce it and evaluate whether we should be doing it. But we're in a global ecosystem, which is going to be difficult to reverse out of. But we've got people looking at all sorts of innovations in terms of aircraft travel to reduce impact. And it is complicated. Most people aspire, or well, maybe that's not quite correct, but an awful lot of people have a car. And when you look at the impact of owning a car, it's absolutely monumental. But we sort of somehow we've been duped into thinking that it's normality that we should have a car to get around. So we've got to go through a huge process of sort of personal evaluation, and also it needs to be legislated so that people can be supported in these decision-making processes.
You mentioned food, and I'm interested in your work with BeNe and Batch.Works, where you used PLA, recycled polylactic acid, sourced from food packaging to create a collection of desk accessories called Be Friends. It was launched, 21, 22? It's the first time you ever made a 3D printed product that's gone to market as opposed to prototyping. Is that right?
That is right, yes. So we met Batch.Works. In fact, when we moved into our new building, or when we were building it, Batch.Works moved in on the opposite corner. And they were a very, very young startup at the time, experimenting with 3D printing. And in fact, at that moment, they were producing visors. They were 3D printing visors for COVID and delivering them by bicycle round to the London hospitals. I think they produced 10,000 in 3 months just in their own Hackney plant. And we started, you're right, that the last, probably 15, 20 years, we've been using rapid prototyping and printing and additive manufacturing primarily for prototyping and product development purposes. And we just started to have a kind of suspicion, if you like, that there might be an opportunity. And we actually put together a little joint venture proposal between Batch.Works and BeNe and Pearson Lloyd to say, let's just test the idea of using this technology, and because it's just getting to the point when you can make an affordable consumer product, which is printed to order. That's one interesting part. Obviously, when you bring in waste material as a waste stream, i.e., coffee cup lids as your raw material for a product, and the circularity that Batch.Works is building and developing in terms of sort of closed loop manufacturing, there were lots of different elements to the process that we became very interested in. And to credit to BeNe for taking the offer to produce a collection. And we actually did it incredibly quickly. I think we pitched the idea in April and we launched it in November. So 6 months from kind of first idea of even starting it to a launch. And the more we get into it, we're very close now to Batch.Works, both sort of creatively and in terms of the organization. And they are really trailblazers into trying to find a space for additive manufacturing within a sort of circularity and within a sustainable kind of paradigm. And so for us to have a slightly more entrepreneurial sort of perspective for product development was also interesting for us.
Desk accessories, things that people keep for years and years and years. I wonder what happens to those products when they're finished.
Well, that's the interesting thing is if you went to a bank and you had 2,000 sort of pen pots for your desks, and then the idea is that if they, in that relationship, once they're no longer needed, they can send them back to Batch.Works and they grind them up and remake them. And they've done some very interesting case studies. If you mold a plastic pen pot, it's all sound very basic stuff, but in China, you have a minimum order of say 2,000 items. You then ship it in a container across to Harwich. You put it in a warehouse. You wait for it to sell. The carbon impact of all those sub-stages, that is the traditional way of making a small object, is 6 times higher than the model that we're working with. So there's some really interesting, very, very serious data. And Batch.Works has a brilliant research funding at the moment through Innovate UK to develop, with Cambridge University, they're developing very, very, very good life cycle analysis so that they can monitor the benefits from a carbon perspective on every product they produce. So it's been a fascinating and really great case study for us in terms of testing what's possible.
So when did this thinking about your practice start? I mean, it seems to me there was a public seating project in Bath, which seems quite pivotal.
I think we've been with different clients and different projects trying to attack some of these issues for a long time, but not all projects you can feed in a lot. And some projects you can get the whole thing to join up. Bath was very interesting because, it's a very complicated city to do a new furniture system for because they've got this very, very carefully managed heritage and sense of themselves. And, so when they make a decision to do something new, it's a big decision. And we were looking at how we could produce something that would last and have a sort of sense of place. And we were also looking at repair with that. How do you put a bench in that doesn't get junked? It can be endlessly repaired. Now, paint's an incredible invention, but it's also quite problematic. It's a very toxic process for nearly all paints, the production of them. The off-gassing when you apply them is really bad. The waste in the pots gets thrown away. And you generally have to paint things every 2 or 3 years, which takes a huge amount of money. So we had this idea of casting the frames of the bench in bronze, which essentially means when the patina gets produced, you never have to paint them. And doing that with the wayfinding system, so they were brass patinated panels. So there is no service required on them, on the metal parts. And at the end of the life, you know that you've got a valuable resource that nobody's going to throw away because you can just melt it down and make something else with them. So we were interested in this idea of creating value in something and not creating cost. And then on the benches, for example, each individual slat, we know there's vandalism and sometimes somebody will jump up on a bench or...
Not in Bath, surely.
It does happen.
Oh, God.
And things need to be repaired and wood rots. So the fact that you can just replace 5 or 6 slats and they can be locally machined was quite compelling. But we've been building in this thinking to all sorts of projects. I mean, even if we're working on a project which sustainability and circularity aren't apparent in the sort of visual presentation of it or the company communication, we're constantly thinking about how much material we're using. And we've been using FEA, finite element analysis, for years with our CAD so that we can evaluate whether we've got excess material in molded structures or, we're always asking the client, can we make that lighter? But, just to give you an example, we were developing a project with a client just 2 years ago. We said, we think it's a bit heavy. And they said, well, we don't think so. And we said, well, for shipping. And they said, well, no, we don't think so. It's, and we said, well, we think it's going to be costly. What we were talking about was the impact in terms of carbon. The heavier something is, the more expensive it is to put in a truck. And they said, well, it's going to cost the same amount because it goes into bandwidths of shipping cost. And we said, no, it's the carbon impact that we're talking about here. And they just hadn't thought about it from that perspective. So it's it is quite difficult because organizations have got different problems that they're trying to solve, different economic problems. And sometimes that clouds the discussion or shifts it to a different point of focus. And it's not that people aren't interested or willing or want to. It's just the sort of emphasis people have upon them is quite often leads them down to a different set of decision-making outcomes. So I think what we've been trying to do, which is partly what the exhibition about, is just expose as much of this debate as possible. And we've certainly been building it into the project briefs with clients, talking about the material choices that we're making, talking about the efficiency, talking about the weight. But we've got things like BIFMA and European standards. We had recently a client tell us that they weren't going to design a product to launch it in America because the American standards are so stringent because of bariatric people that there's an excess of material in the product. So that was surprising news to us. So in other words, everything is slightly over-engineered for a relatively small minority of people.
Interesting.
But if you think of the global impact of that, it's massive.
It's huge. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm keen to talk about your background, if that's okay, because you met at the Royal College of Art in the early 90s. Tom, you'd studied furniture at Nottingham, and Luke, you'd done industrial design at Central St Martin's. You swapped over your MAs. I'm interested in why. Tom, why did you decide to do industrial design at the RCA?
I felt that the craft of furniture was just slightly too limiting. And actually, you're getting now to the roots of kind of how Luke and I found the sort of synergy to start, because I think we both in different ways saw that each was not quite enough. And culturally, a lot of furniture studios are very small, one-man band, two-man, a designer with a couple of assistants, and then you have the bigger industrial design agencies. And there was always a big gap culturally between those different tribes, in a way, of our design sector. And I think certainly I felt that it wasn't enough to be a classical trained furniture designer. I wanted to get closer to the market. I was fascinated in mass production. I was fascinated in doing stuff that wasn't sort of elite or exclusive or one-off. In fact, Luke and I have never done any commissioned work for one-off work or for gallery work. We've always been sort of more inclined towards the mass, if you like.
And Luke, why did you make the change?
Well, funnily enough, I mean, just to fill in a little bit, Tom's father was an architect and his mum was a painter. So we've clearly come from creative backgrounds. My father was a painter and my mum was a fashion designer.
Yeah, she used to run the fashion course at Winchester, right?
She did. And I, just like my brother, we grew up just making things continually. And I think because it was just something we did every single weekend, there wasn't really a sort of very fertile conversation about that being the future. And I was very, very interested in science and geology and the way the world worked. And I sort of thought, well, what I do at the weekends is just who I am. It hadn't occurred to me to do it for a career. I then looked at the prospectus of Central St Martin's industrial design, and it was very broad. And I thought, this is perfect. But actually, when I embarked on the course, I think I felt a little bit of a reaction against packaging design, product design as packaging,
right,
where you were essentially putting a skin around relatively temporary technology. And then as soon as there was sort of, as far as I could see, microscopic updates to that technology, it gave you the permission to do a new skin around it. And I just thought that was hugely wasteful. So I started thinking about time and impact and did my thesis on sustainability, basically recycling and conspicuous consumption. And then suddenly the penny sort of dropped, and my mum had been buying antiques all our lives, and the house was full of sort of strange bits of junk and things she'd found in shops or at the end of the road. I started thinking about the sort of pace of change that is applied to furniture. And in a way, humans don't change at all, but furniture somehow changes. It's either through fashion or materiality or some strange functional overlap with now technology. So I think in a way our interests sort of overlapped, almost opposing interests, but from the same sense of same sort of observational place, if that makes sense. And we started talking about this sort of duality. And when we set the studio up in 97, actually you were either a product designer or an architect or a furniture designer. And we were very interested in this sort of cross-platform dialogue. And obviously because Tom had done furniture and industrial design and I'd done industrial design and furniture, this tussle was the same. And again, like Tom, we were both very interested in mass production. What is the impact that we can achieve through mass production? Can we apply the same love of design and craft and value into objects that are mass produced? So sort of for me, it was the opposite of fast-moving consumer goods. And for Tom, I think probably it was to imbue objects with a degree of sophistication and technology that you might otherwise not get through traditional furniture design.
And was it instantly apparent that you'd both work together? I mean, you've talked a little bit, but also what areas you'd work in, because not many of your generation went into workplace design, for example. That was a conscious decision, I'm guessing, Tom.
I think when we started, I mean, Luke and I joked recently that we're sort of like magpies. We've kind of instinctively gone seeking out different types of work, which is why we've got some healthcare things. We've got some urban design in there. And it's quite a broad spectrum, the portfolio over time. I think what we were interested in, Modus was one of our very first English clients and one of our very early clients. And Modus was at the front end of a new generation of makers in the UK, or brands that could almost exist without owning their own factory, because there was outsourcing had allowed you to find upholstery, find frame making, find different supply chains of making, and you wouldn't have to own it all yourself. And I think when we started, we had to get on a train and a plane and go around the fairs of Europe and sort of, get the courage up to walk onto the stand and say, what about us?
Are you a natural salesman? Can you sell yourself in that sense?
I'm not. Luke is brilliant at it. He's very happy to go and demand to speak to someone. And I tend to lurk in the corridors. Well, luckily we don't have to do that so often these days. But we were naturally drawn into the furniture industry. And actually our work has been more workplace than consumer. Some of our work is now for the home, but we're also fascinated by the ergonomics of space and how space and behaviour go together to make a product relevant. And actually the collab, the education product, is a really good example of that, where we were understanding what the needs of people and then trying to develop furniture solutions that sort of fulfill or improve or express those needs in a positive way. And I think mostly home-based furniture is quite archetypal: sofa, chair, table, shelf, and it's still beautiful because you can work those archetypes forever. But we're very, very interested in what we call intelligent space and the intelligence of space, where our thinking sits somewhere between. It's not quite what architects do. It's not what interior designers do. We like to kind of inquire and interrogate how people behave in a space. And it happens that the office is a really, really fertile place for that. And it's the change that we've experienced over 25 years from, just simple things like the laptop or the flat screen.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, the change in workplace is largely down to changes in technology, surely. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We've all detethered from Ethernet cables and from our phone line. Suddenly you can migrate in a different way, and now you can be mobile. And the Parks range we did for Bene in 2009 was an example of that sort of early inquiry into the sort of redistribution of functions in an office space. And now we're, hybrid work, and the world of hybrid post-COVID is, again, a hugely interesting and challenging sort of paradigm that we're all having to figure out. Organizations are, manufacturers are. Where do people work and why? We're all truly liberated now by a laptop and a mobile phone. We can work wherever we like. But the needs of people, the needs of being together, those are becoming more and more important. And interestingly, the university campuses are suffering just as much in terms of encouraging people to come back and be together and collaborate and see each other. And a lot of our collab project was trying to create environments that people would be more inclined to come to see and come to spend time in.
I'm always intrigued by duos and what you both bring to the relationship. So when you drive a change in the practices we've been talking about, is there one of you driving it, or are you both in lockstep the whole time? What do you both bring to the equation, I guess is what I'm asking. Luke?
No, we're not in lockstep at all. And I think a lot of the time that's quite important, because sometimes you can fall in love with your own idea and you run away with it, and you're a bit, it's just like falling in love with somebody. You can't see all the bad bits. So I think as a partnership, at its best, you bring a sort of balancing perspective to it. And at worst, you can, it's a dead weight because the other person would be running along at pace, and you're sort of slowing them down. So I think it's a it's a sort of tentative entity a lot of the time, because you've got to sort of be a little bit reflective and respectful of the fact that you may not agree with the other person, but you've got to sort of work out how you temper your instinctive response and try and open your mind up to something that might be a possibility, which, okay, I wouldn't go down that route, but what happens if we do? So for me, I think my interest is in actually those differences and where they can shift the perspectives. And to be fair, we get it with every single person that we work with. The people in the studio bring that to us. Our clients bring that to us. If you want to work as a sole trader and sort of have a fingerprint that you dictate onto everything, then, that's one route, and there are people that do it. But it's certainly never been anything that I've been interested in. I'm much more interested in a sort of collaborative process where a series of minds bring a series of elements to play, and then there's a sort of directed result, a carefully directed result. May not answer your question, that.
It's getting there, but I'll probe a bit more. Tom, the importance of difference between the pair of you.
I think it's critical, and I think there's two little cliches to throw out here. One is someone once said that, marriage, definition of marriage is seeing the world through someone else's eyes. And I always thought that was a beautifully poetic way of understanding partnership. And obviously we're not in an actual marriage, but creatively someone sees something else, looks at the same stuff and sees something else. And that's actually can be a very, very powerful tool. It can also accelerate problem solving, because often you're stuck and Luke might pop in and say, have you thought of this? And you hadn't, or vice versa. And it creates a sort of, it accelerates the ability to solve problems. And there's a Matthew Syed, the journalist
and table tennis player.
Yeah. Wrote a book called Rebel Minds a couple of years ago, all about cognitive diversity and how you need, it's not neurodiversity, but you need people with different perspectives, different minds, sharing the same problem. That is the way you can solve the world's issues, by having this true diversity of thinking. And I suppose naturally, Luke and I, we definitely wake up thinking about different things and worrying about different things. That's a good thing.
What do you wake up thinking about, Tom?
Have I slept enough? Usually. But no, we have different worries and we have different things that preoccupy us. And that's a good, healthy part of partnership.
Yeah. I'm going to probe a little bit more, but not too much longer. But I am quite intrigued. Do you fall into stereotypes? I remember people talking about Monty Python and how John Cleese, who was very English, quite restrained, and you had Terry Jones, who was Welsh and Celtic and emotional, which caused interesting creative fireworks. I'm just wondering if you two fall into similar camps.
I would certainly say Monty Python's a really great analogy. We're definitely both emotional, that's for sure. We can get very heated and passionate about something, but I think one of the things we're mostly, I would say, we're quite good at is if somebody's really serious about something, what we've been quite good at is looking the other person in the eye and thinking, okay, you're a little bit more serious than I am. I'm going to go with your way. And I think that's we've been lucky, because we could have just locked horns, on multiple occasions, but actually both of us have got the ability to release, I think. And we don't do a lot of, I told you we should have done that, because that's very, 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 occasionally we do it. But I think mostly it's from a perspective of trying to remember where we made our mistakes so we can modify the behaviors. But that's another thing, somebody said to me the other day, it was quite funny. They said, oh, it must be great, having done this for so long and knowing what you're doing. And I'm thinking, well, not really. I think both of us quite interested in the fact that we want to find projects that we haven't done before, that forces us to look at the world with fresh eyes or ask new questions. There are quite a lot of designers out there that you can see them just perfecting a style and they get asked to do the same project again and again. And it's something that I'm always very fearful of, the notion of boredom. And I think
I was going to ask about this. Did you know immediately when you first got together in 97 how you would work? Because I think visitors to the fair will realise there isn't a Pearson Lloyd aesthetic, as some design studios very definitely have. The practice has operated in a different way, really, from the start.
Well, one of the things, I'll just start maybe, Tom, one of the things we're very clear about is we wrote down a very funny little double-side A4 page in the pub whilst we were sort of formulating the studio 27 years ago. And one of the things we said was we won't subscribe to dogma or fashion, which was we'll try and look at each problem with fresh eyes. And obviously, if one of us is leading a project, which invariably happens at some point, one of us has the germ of the idea, and generally that person continues to develop it, even if the other person's coming in and workshopping it. So we'll always end up with a sort of skew on a project, depending on who's leading it. The client also has a big impact. You know, their brand and us doing something that's appropriate for their brand or appropriate for their market or appropriate for their audience, that should have an influence. You know, we're not artists where, you know, people are not buying a Damien Hirst here. You know, we are designing for people, for an application, for a space, for a locality, you know, for a location. And all those things create an influence, which I think is a distinction which is different to art. And so I think design should have a flexibility about it. I mean, I think we do have a hand, and I think we definitely do have an approach, which, you know, people recognize. But we've never wanted it to be tight to the point where it's on brand in that way.
Yeah.
It feels a bit restrictive to me.
Yeah. Well, look, our time is nearly up. Thank you very much. I mean, obviously, you have the fair coming up, and you'll also be doing a talk with Debbie Ray of Crafts Magazine. But, final question, what else can we expect from you in the future, Tom?
Well, without mentioning individual projects, I think I'm incredibly motivated, and I think Luke is as well, about the challenges that the world faces and design's ability or participation in those challenges. You know, and climate change and circularity and sustainability is one where we can have a practical impact, but actually the way in which the world is shifting and hopefully design can make a contribution to understanding and responding to those shifts and those changes is a very, very dynamic moment for the world. And I think as a result, it should be a very inspiring place to be a designer. And I think that figuring that out, I think, is my most exciting kind of sense. And I feel like, just touching on the last little theme very, very quickly, I think we do have, our hand may be different, but the way our process of thinking, we've developed over a long time. And so we're quite excited by being given quite intractable challenges to try and solve, confident that the way we think about the world can begin to elicit good solutions. And I think that's something that we'll both be wanting to continue figuring out.
Very good. Well, that's it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, and I will see you at the fair.
Thank you very much. See you soon.
Great pleasure, Grant.
To find out more about Tom, Luke and Pearson Lloyd, go to pearsonlloyd.com. My thanks go to the series and fair headline sponsor, the brilliant lighting specialist, Bert Frank. You can find out more about them at bertfrank.co.uk. And you can see its products at the Material Matters Fair, which is running from the 20th to the 23rd of September at Bargehouse, Oxo Tower Wharf. It could easily be on while you're listening to this. It's free for trade, but it's vital that you register before you arrive. For more information on that, to find the other podcasts that I've done, and to sign up to our newsletter, go to materialmatters.design. As ever, there are images from the interviews on our Instagram page, which is also materialmatters.design. Finally, this is really important too. If you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this from. And it would make me incredibly happy if you went to my Patreon page and made a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. For as little as £2.50 a month, you can receive an invite to various Material Matters events, as well as getting access to each episode before it's published to the wider world. Material Matters is a completely independent concern, and any help you can offer would be hugely appreciated. Ultimately, you'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening.